Now, it's been argued that the 1920s and 30s there was a brief truce between two halves in one conflict, but I believe that the issues fought over in the two world wars were significantly different. Like all European wars, they were both about balance of power, but where the first war was fought among monarchies and republics whose regimes seemed to be stable, the second was fought over ideology as well: totalitarianism versus democracy, communism versus fascism versus democracy, and racialism versus equality. Now, put another way, it could be argued that the diplomats at Versailles had done such a poor job that the Second War became a life and death struggle for civilization itself, for all the good that civilization had accomplished up to 1939. Now, the first military action of the 1930s was the Japanese invasion of Manchuria in 1931. Japan had been forced to accept contact with the West in the mid 19th century. Now, this led to a powerful anti Western feeling in 19th century Japan, and this led in turn to a coup and civil war, which established the Meiji dynasty on the imperial throne from 1868 to 1869. Now, the new government abolished feudalism and established the emperor's central authority, modeling its structure on that of Imperial Germany. Now, the new dynasty imported European advisors to facilitate a modernization campaign. The new Japanese state embraced imperialism in the 19th century to join in competition with the West, to spread the benefits of Japanese civilization to the rest of Asia, and to protect its western flank. Now, these goals explain a series of conflicts and acquisitions. In 1894, the Japanese won the first Sino-Japanese War, resulting in the takeover of Taiwan and forcing free trade with China. Now, because this threatened Russian interest in Asia, it eventually led to the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905. And as a result of Japan's victory in this war, it was granted the Liaodong Peninsula at the southern tip of Manchuria. In 1907, Japan deposed the ruler of Korea and began an incursion that resulted in its annexation as the province of Chosen in 1910. Now, Japan fought on the Allied side in World War I and acquired the Marshall, Caroline, and Marianas Islands. Now, by 1920, Japan was a major industrial and military power. Now, in the 1920s and 30s, Japan experienced social and economic unrest not unlike the West. The 20s saw a collapse of prosperity aggravated by the Kyoto earthquake in 1923. The Depression hit Japan hard, as did in the West, and many people lost their faith in democratic capitalism. Now, this loss of faith strengthened two right-wing groups. In 1932, Prime Minister Inukai Tsuyoshi was assassinated, and henceforward Japan was ruled by a coalition of radical nationalists, militarists, and imperialists in the name of Emperor Hirohito. Now, this government concluded that Japan could compete with Western countries only by subduing its neighbors and seizing raw materials. The Japanese also feared the rise of a strong nationalist Chinese movement that called for the ouster of imperialist powers, including Japan, from China. Japan feared the rise of the Chinese Communist movement, which they believed would ally with the Soviet Union and overrun Asia. Some saw expansion into China as a way to cure Japan's economic troubles by awarding its farmland to Japanese peasants and seizing its raw materials. In September of 1931, the Japanese forces occupying Korea invaded Manchuria, creating a puppet state. Now, this action was condemned by the League of Nations and the US, but no military assistance was offered to China. Japan left the League in 1933. It signed an anti-communist pact with Germany in 1936 and with Italy in 1937. Now, throughout the 30s, tension remained high on the new Sino-Japanese border. In 1937, Japan launched a strike and seized Beijing, Shanghai, and the capital city of Nanking. Japanese atrocities in Nanking, in particular, shocked the world. By the end of 1938, Japan controlled most of northern China. the Chinese nationalist leader Chiang Kai-shek had retreated to the mountains in the south. Nationalists and communists launched a guerrilla war that the Japanese would never be able to suppress. Now, it could be argued that this is the real start of World War II, but both then and later, it has been relegated to the footnotes of history. Now, Hitler made clear in Mein Kampf that he would repudiate the Treaty of Versailles, rearm, and restore German greatness. In October of 1933, Germany withdrew from the League of Nations and the Paris Disarmament Conference. In March of 1935, Hitler publicly repudiated the disarmament provisions of Versailles and announced plans for a rejuvenated army, air force, and navy. In fact, Germany had been rearming in secret for years, and to forestall criticism, Hitler signed treaties with Poland and Britain. At this point, the French, seeing the writing on the wall, made overtures to their ally, Russia. The first European blood spilled by German arms would flow in Spain, where civil war broke out from 1936 to 1939. Spain was a poor, weak constitutional monarchy at the beginning of the 20th century and had remained neutral in World War I. Demand for the products of Spanish agriculture and manufacturing in Europe during the war led to a boom, and the boom and inflation led workers and soldiers to demand higher wages. In September of 1923, General Primo de Rivera led a military coup. His regime was not particularly brutal, and in 1929, he resigned. At this point, the monarchy should have been a focus for loyalty, but it was resented by the right for having given in to dictatorship and by the left for its conservatism. In 1931, the Spanish people elected a Republican government, supported initially by all sides. The government pursued progressive policies at first, but for many, especially those on the right, the new freedoms were too much too soon, and Spain entered a period of disunity. Beginning in July of 1936, a rebellion broke out between the fascist nationalists under Francisco Franco and Republican loyalists. Left-leaning sympathizers from around the world flocked to Spain to fight the Republicans. Stalin sent troops and material. Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy responded with land, air, and naval support for Franco, allowing the Nazis to test their new weapons and military techniques. In the end, Franco's forces triumphed, and in the aftermath of the war, he executed 37,000 and imprisoned thousands more. Now, Franco's victory, along with the accession of right-wing governments in Austria, Hungary, Romania, and Portugal, rendered most of southern and central Europe fascist or quasi-fascist by 1939. Now, as with the disarmament provisions, Hitler argued that the territorial provisions of Versailles were unfair, and that an expanding German population needed Lebensraum, which had been denied by Versailles. On the 7th of March 1936, Hitler's army marched into the Rhineland. This march was very risky. Hitler's forces were still tiny and poorly equipped. The French, though, would not act without British help. And the British, under the coalition cabinets of Ramsay MacDonald and Stanley Baldwin, offered none. Now, why did the British pursue and the French accept a policy of appeasement towards Hitler in the mid to late 1930s? The memory of the Great War was so terrible that Europeans were determined to avoid repeating it. In the wake of the Depression, Britain and France did not have the funds to rearm. By the mid-30s, revisionist historians had discredited the Versailles settlement, leading to guilt and a sense that Germany had a right to even the score. And finally, to many in Europe, and as bad as Hitler and the Nazis were, they represented an alternative to and a bulwark against Stalin and communism. The few politicians and observers who saw through Hitler, most notably Winston Churchill, were out of power in the 1930s. Thus, when German troops marched into Austria in March of 1938, leading to its annexation, known as the Anschluss, to the Reich, Britain and France stood by. Austria's post-war history was similar to Germany's. At the close of the war, World War I that is, the Austrian military had collapsed on all fronts. The Austro-Hungarian Empire broke up as formerly subject peoples declared their independence and established republics. And Austria's weak governments coped unsuccessfully with economic turmoil, culminating in the Depression. And as in Germany, this produced a powerful socialist party and a growing Nazi party. In 1933, the right-wing premier, Engelbert Dollfuss, dissolved parliament, abolished civil rights, and began to rule by decree. He was assassinated in July. In 1935, the new Prime Minister, Kurt von Schuschnigg, sought Italian support to maintain independence, but he soon tentatively agreed to annexation by Germany. In 1938, Schuschnigg seemed to reverse course, calling for a plebiscite to determine the question. Hitler ordered troops across the border on the 12th of March 1938, and Austria became Ostmark, the newest state of the German Reich. Hitler justified the annexation by saying that he was merely correcting Bismarck's mistake in 1871 when he unified Germany and left Austria out. The rest of the world viewed the annexation as an internal German matter. Now, similarly, later in 1938, when Hitler demanded autonomy for the 3.5 million Germans living in Czechoslovakia, in an area known as the Sudetenland, the British and French were receptive. Neville Chamberlain of England, Edouard Dallier de France, and Mussolini of Italy agreed to talk with Hitler, during which the Czechs had little voice over what happened to their own country. Now, at first, Hitler demanded autonomy only for the Sudeten Germans, and when Hitler saw how tractable the French and British were, he demanded the territories surrender to Germany. And on the 29th and 30th of September, over the protest of the Czechs, Chamberlain, Daladier, and Mussolini agreed to transfer part of Czechoslovakia to Germany. On the 15th of March 1939, the German army crossed the newly drawn Czech border and absorbed the rest of Czechoslovakia. Now, the British and French began to realize what they were up against. Now, following this naked aggression, the British and French began to prepare for war. Both countries launched emergency rearmament drives. In March of 1939, Britain promised to guarantee Polish security. In April, Britain and France offered the same to Greece and Romania. On the 23rd of August 1939, Nazi Germany and Communist Russia countered by announcing a non-aggression pact. Now, this pact guaranteed that, should war come, Germany would not have to fight on two fronts. It gave the Soviet Union the friend it had been seeking for so long, and what had once been its most hated enemy. Finally, in a secret clause, the two dictators agreed to carve Europe into spheres of influence, beginning with Poland. Now, as early as April 1939, Hitler had instructed the German General Staff to prepare for war with Poland. At 4:45 a.m. on the 1st of September 1939, following a manufactured border incident, the guns of the German battleship Schleswig-Holstein fired on Polish shore batteries at Gdansk. The Luftwaffe launched massive strikes on communications and airfields, while German tanks rolled across the border. World War II in Europe had begun.